Just a quick reminder before we start this video that I have a stationery shop where I sell stationery I've designed to help with productivity. The yearly planner is still available, as well as this versatile notebook and a range of to-do list pads, which will be linked down below. Hello, it's Ruby, and it feels like it's been a really long time since I filmed. I know it actually hasn't been that long. I did a vlog maybe last week, but I had my very last university exam ever yesterday, which is crazy. If I do a master's, I might not even have exams. That could have been my last exam ever, which is it really does feel like the end of an era. But anyway, today I'm going to be filming a video which I should have filmed at the beginning of this year, but I didn't, which is all of the books I read in 2021. So last year I managed to read 136 books, which is less than I read in 2020. I read 150 in 2020, but I read some really good books, and that is the main thing. Going to just go through these, say maybe a little bit about every book. I probably won't talk about every single book, especially the first 20 I read in January, and then I filmed a wrap-up video for January with reviews of all of these books. If you want to hear more comprehensive reviews of those, then you can go to that video. And I also filmed my favourite books of 2021 halfway through the year, so I'll direct you towards that as well. I've filmed this video every year since 2015. As always, at the end of the video I will go through my top 5 books of the year, which is really always so hard to choose, and I haven't actually chosen my top 5 of the year yet, so I know that by the end of the video it'll be like, oh, these are my top 50 books of the year. So I started the year by reading Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett, which is a children's book which I had never read. It's obviously one of the most famous girls' literature books, more famous than The Little Princess, which is my personal favourite book of all time. Hodgson Burnett is an Edwardian writer. It's about Mary Lennox, who is sent to live with her uncle in the middle of nowhere in this large house, and she discovers a garden. Mary is really a very unpleasant character, very unpleasant, but over the course of the book, by being reconnected with nature, she is able to reform. Next I read Mary Barton by Elizabeth Gaskell, which is a Condition of England novel. This is a Victorian book. This is about Mary Barton, a working class woman who is the daughter of a mill worker. In this book she's really exposing just the extent of poverty that existed in England, and she puts that next to middle class people and the mill owners, right back to back, to show just how distinct that distinction is. Next I read The Invention of Hugo Cabret. You've probably seen the Scorsese film, which is wonderful. This is about a boy who lives at a train station and is responsible for winding back the clocks. The amazing thing about this book is how it's written. It's half writing and then half illustrations, which are meant to resemble a silent film. I reread Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. Fantastic, fiery character Jane Eyre, who is an orphan, sent to charity school, then goes to become a governess, and it's kind of about her relationship with Rochester. I just love the Brontes so much. They're so ahead of their time. When you're reading them, you could easily be reading something that was published 5 years ago. I read The Conference of Birds by Ransom Riggs, which is the 4th book in the Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children series, which is a little bit like Harry Potter in that you've got the real world and then you've got this fantasy world. I read The Painter of Modern Life and Other Essays by Charles Baudelaire, which might be my favourite book of essays I've ever read. In The Painter of Modern Life especially, he is talking about how artists see the world through the eyes of children, and basically how our main goal in life is to get back to that way of seeing things, and that's why people love art, because they want to be able to see things in that way again. And the only difference between an artist and a child is that the artist is able to articulate that, whereas a child can't. I read Aurora Leigh by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. It's a poem, and in that sense quite similar to books like The Odyssey or The Iliad, these incredible epic poems. Apart from, instead of it being this elaborate journey taken by Odysseus, it's domestic, and it's the life of a woman, which is really cool. Yes, in history men go on all of these journeys, and those adventures are the things that we have documented and remember, but Aurora Leigh shows us that women, even though historically they have had domestic roles, like that doesn't mean that these stories aren't worth documenting. I think it's a really seminal piece and very worth reading. Next I read The 10 to Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte, another wonderful Bronte book which I spoke about extensively in the January review video, if you want to go and look at that, because this book blew me away. A reread, I read it when I was 12, but I just like fell in love with this book all over again. It's about a mysterious woman who moves into Wildfell Hall and nobody knows who she is. It's narrated by this man who is like fascinated by her though. She ends up giving him her diary and he recounts her diary to us, and we basically find out about the marriage which this lady has had. Maybe I'm not selling it, but it's just incredible and I love the way that it uses a diary narrative. Then next I read The Holocaust in American Life by Peter Novick. This is looking at the history of the Holocaust and how remembrance began. So if you didn't know, very strangely, between 1945 and 1970 there really wasn't a Holocaust remembrance in public life. It had just happened and yet it was almost like it had been like shunted to the back. Mass media wasn't relaying what happened in the Holocaust, so it was just sidelined. And then in the 1970s it experienced a resurgence because of a television show. But Peter Novick basically examines how Holocaust remembrance has changed in America and offers like a kind of solution for how it should continue. I also read Eichmann in Jerusalem by Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt was at the Eichmann trial. Eichmann was put on trial for the final solution after the Holocaust as like part of the Nuremberg trials, and Hannah Arendt was present at that trial, and this is her documenting what happened in the trial but also proposing her famous banality of evil argument. I also read 2 short stories by Edgar Allan Poe, The Mask of the Red Death, which is genuinely so worth reading now while like lockdown is still very much in our minds, because it's so relevant, thinking about like class distinctions, etc. And I also read Hop Frog, and I also put down on here The Cry of the Children by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the same author as Aurora Leigh, which was a sentimentalist poem which was supposed to like drive a fact and encourage people to take poverty seriously in Victorian London. Next, On Earth We Are Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong, which is a letter that a man has written to his mother who cannot read, so we know the whole way through that she's not going to read this, but it's kind of his memoirs, but it's written in a very lyrical style. Also jumps between time frames a lot. I love this book and have gone back over it since. It's one of those books that you just want to own. Just every single line makes you think about things in a new way, and isn't that kind of the purpose of literature? Like, you read something and it helps you understand something in a new way. Like, you read it and you're like, oh, that's so true, but I never even realised I had that thought. It's one of those books. Next, Bat Wings and Petticoats by Blakeney Clark, who is my housemate, and she wrote this children's book. It's set in Victorian London, story of this girl who grows bat wings and a tail and is forced to hide these with like her crinolines. Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. Now, if you've watched some of my book videos before, you might know that I'm not a Jane Austen fan, which surprises some people too. And I really like the idea of liking Jane Austen, and I like the movie adaptations, but I just don't really like the books. But this book did change my perspective on that. I had read Mansfield Park, Pride and Prejudice, Persuasion, and I didn't like any of those, but I actually really liked Sense and Sensibility. It's about 3 sisters. They move to this cottage and each of them has a love interest. Eleanor Dashwood is such a great character. Like, I just loved her so much. She actually reminds me a bit of Jo March in Little Women, and it's really encouraged me to read some more of Jane Austen's work and like at least go back and try her again, because maybe I just read those books when I wasn't in the right mindset. Like, I read Mansfield Park and Pride and Prejudice really quite a while ago, and so maybe my perspective has just changed and I will like them now. So goal for myself is to read more Jane Austen. Next, I read The Wonderful Adventures of Mrs. Seacole in Many Lands by Mary Seacole. This was one of the books on my Victorian literature module. Mary Seacole was a nurse during the Crimea War, so at the same time as Florence Nightingale. However, whilst like every single child in the world knows about Florence Nightingale, Mary Seacole is distinctly absent from the historical narrative. I think it's just another example of people of colour being neglected from that historical narrative. Florence Nightingale obviously did do very important work, but she had a managerial role, so she didn't actually do that much work with like the men themselves, like on an individual basis. I think like we tend to think that she did more than she actually did. Whereas Mary Seacole was known for having these very like close, intense relationships with the men, and she was like known as Mother Seacole. She was a very warm personality, and she did very important work, and yet we don't really know about her. And so it's really cool actually hearing her story in this narrative. I don't know why I went into it thinking it was going to read like a piece of fiction, because it's not, it's memoirs, but there isn't really a distinct like storyline to it. I think she assumes that we know her story already, because when it was written she was known in the public consciousness, whereas today she's not really. Next, I read Feeling Sorry for Cecilia by Jocelyn Moriarty. Didn't really like this book. This is a YA book narrated by a girl whose friend goes missing, like she runs off to join the circus, and it's written in a really cool way. Like there are postcards and articles and letters and like diary entries, and the fusion of all of those like forms of writing is really cool, but the actual storyline is not very compelling, and it's very like pink spinner book, which is what my librarian used to call it. Next I read Anne of the Island by Ellen Montgomery. So this is the third book in the Anne of Green Gables series, and it's where Anne goes to university or like college, and I love this. I think this is my favourite of the Anne books. I loved the first one, the second one was okay, and the third one was just incredible. I think it's because she is at university, and because I'm at university, she just retains the whole spirit of Anne even though she's away at university. It's a really cool thing to read because it shows that you can like retain that sense of like gratitude, etc., like no matter where you are, and that the core of your identity isn't based on where you are. Next, I read Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. Don't have to give a synopsis for that. We read this for my Victorian module. Loved rereading it. Really cool to actually study it in an academic sense as well, because Carroll's use of nonsense and his like use of like illustrations, he's so attentive to the process of reading, which is what I love so much about like reading Lewis Carroll now. It's worth rereading now, I think. The Victorian Girl and the Feminine Ideal by Deborah Gorham. I did quite a lot of research into Victorian girlhood on this module and read chapters and extracts from a lot of books. This one was my favourite I read though, and I read it front to back in the end because she just writes in a really compelling way. If you want an overview of like Victorian girlhood, this is the book to read. Next I read The Nursery Alice by Lewis Carroll. Again, this is a book I actually wrote my essay on in comparison with Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and it was published in 1889. It's embarrassing because I wrote an essay on this. 1889. It's basically adapting the Alice story for children 0 to 5 years old, and the big difference there then is, whereas Alice's Adventures in Wonderland can be read by the child, this book is made for the mother to read to the child, and it's cool looking at how the story differs in that capacity. It definitely reads more as like a piece of moral literature, like it's like teaching kids to be moral, which is really quite interesting because that's like basically the opposite of what he was trying to do with Alice. Next I read The Coral Island by R.M. Ballantyne. This was very uncomfortable to read. I have seen it in bookshops, like in the children's section of Waterstones since, and I can't believe there's not a warning on it. There should be a content warning because very racist, very colonialist. These 3 boys are stranded on a desert island, white British man as conqueror, who is able to like help the people native to the country that they've landed on. I mean, it was interesting to read in like an academic sense, like thinking about boys grew up reading this kind of literature, but it is uncomfortable to read. Next, Introducing Children's Literature. This is like basically a history of children's literature. So it starts with the romantic construction of the child. The romantic child is very much unsullied, uncorrupted, you know, like pre-lapsarian, and so it starts with the romantics, and then it goes Victorian literature, Edwardian literature, right through to, I think it stops with Roald Dahl. I might be wrong, it might go further, but it's a really great overview. A lecturer recommended that to me and I really enjoyed it. Next I read Health and Girlhood in Britain, 1874 to 1920 by Hilary Marland. Very random book, but again, interesting. I do find like the development of the construct of the child very interesting. Age, there's nothing concrete about it, so the way that different cultures and times will define child is going to differ so much, and yet so much of like so many legal structures, so much protection for young people is based on like that one definition. I think it'd be very trivial, just like the word child, and I think it's an interesting thing to look at. But Health and Girlhood in Britain looks at like medical constructions of girlhood and also health advice which was offered to girls. Next I read Alice's Adventures Underground by Lewis Carroll, which is I'm not going to be able to say this. A facsimile of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Lewis Carroll originally wrote it for Alice Liddell. They had been on a boat trip together and he'd told the little children this story, and then he'd written it up, like handwritten it and illustrated it and given it to her, and Lewis Carroll published the scan of this 20 odd years after Alice's Adventures in Wonderland was published. It's so worth reading. It's very, very different from the original book as well. Next, I read Nature by Ralph Waldo Emerson. So this is split into 8 sections or books. As always with Emerson, beautifully written. And it encourages us to look at the world, appreciate natural beauty. There's this one line I loved, which was, "If we only saw the stars once and didn't become accustomed to them, we would think them utterly glorious." Nature always wears the colours of the spirit. To a man labouring under calamity, the heart of his own fire hath sadness in it. Like the idea that we put our own emotions into nature. If we look at a sunrise, when we're happy, we're going to see like glory in it, beauty in it, whereas if we're sad, when we look at it, it might look melancholy. I think that's a cool idea. Next, I read Film on the Holocaust by Aaron Kerner, which is basically a history of like cinematic adaptations of the Holocaust and examining like whether it actually is appropriate for us to depict the Holocaust on screen. Next, I read Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens. It was very long. That's bad for that to be the first thing I say about it, the first thing I remember about it, but this was like a 900-page mammoth book. It's a shame because I read it in a week for my module and I had to read it very quickly. Like 900 pages in a week is a lot. And so I was rushing through it a bit, which I'm annoyed at. Cutting examination of Victorian society, as with so many of Charles Dickens's books. And this one is about mistaken identity. You've got 2 plots. The subplot is brilliantly hilarious, like making fun of like appearances and superficialities in society with the veneerings, like the idea of like the veneering of them. It's also cool thinking about how it was published in installments and you can actually see the time frame is the same as when they were being published, so you have like winter and summer coming at the same times, which I love. And it kind of makes you want to read it in installments in the way it was published. Next, Norwegian Wood by Haruki Murakami, which is the first Murakami book I'd actually ever read. I really like this. Again, quite lyrical. I know I say lots of books are lyrical, but I tend to like choose lyrical books and it's one of the main selling points for me. Like a lyrical book is my favourite kind of book, and so when I say a book is lyrical, it's me saying, wow, I love the writing style so much. I really loved how you had like the interweaving of time and different people, and it just felt like, the thing I loved about this book is that it just felt very real. Like just the things that happen to these characters are real, like it's what happens in real life, which is so refreshing to read. There were some quite graphic scenes though, which I've got to say I didn't particularly enjoy, but other than that I really liked it. Next, Girlhood by Marion Farringham, book published in the Victorian period. I think I want to say it's the 1880s. Farringham wrote this guide for girls on like how to be good at being a girl, and it's separated into sections like friendship and like religion, all of these like different aspects of being a girl, and it's just a fascinating insight. Next, The Midnight Library by Matt Haig, which I adored. It's such a clever concept for a book. So this woman dies and she is confronted with this library filled with books, brimming with books, and each of these books contains a different life that she could have led. So every time that you make a decision, your life like goes 2 different ways. Each of these books is based on like one of those other decisions. The woman is told that she can go and try one of these lives and then go back to that life and like reincarnate. And so she goes through and like tries different lives, etc. It's just such a clever concept, and I wish that it had been longer and that there is a sequel or something, because it was just the coolest book ever, I think. And I wasn't sure what to expect of it as well, because the concept is so good that you think like, will the book just rely on the concept? But no, like the writing style too, it's just like it's just very good. It's very fast-paced. Next, I read Alice's Adventures Through the Looking Glass. Then The Trial of God by Elie Wiesel, which is a play. So Wiesel was a Holocaust survivor, and he also wrote Night, which is his most famous work. Wiesel says that the Holocaust is utterly unique, and that this means that we can't represent the Holocaust head-on, so like literature and films, etc. can't represent it. He demonstrates this in this book. This is based on an actual trial which he witnessed in Auschwitz, where a group of Jewish men and rabbis put God on trial, asking whether he was responsible and guilty for the suffering of Jewish people during the Holocaust. Yeah, so Wiesel bases it on this actual trial, but he displaces the book. So instead of having that trial like take place in Auschwitz, it takes place during the pogroms, which was another case in Europe where Jewish people were persecuted. People Like Her by Ellery Lloyd, about a mum influencer who is honestly awful. Like, she's such a horrible character. So she's very, very false. She's got her like online persona, and then she's got her real life persona, and both of them are so removed, and everything she does is calculated in order to get like more views, more clicks, etc. Very not a very nice presentation of influencers, I've got to say. Really gives you a lot of food for thought. Also raises some really key issues about privacy, which really scared me, I've got to say personally. And the first half of the book is very much like establishing these themes of like social media, and then the second half is more thriller based and becomes very fast paced. Such a Fun Age by Kylie Reid. Lots of people have been recommending this to me, and I loved the concept so much. This is about a black babysitter who's babysitting a white child, and she's at this like convenience store, and someone accuses her of having stolen this child, and it's basically the aftermath of what happens with that. So enlightening. Preconceived stereotypes and how like racism is so systematic and embedded within the very fabric of American life and like British life as well. I also like how the narrative is split between like the babysitter and then her employer. Next, I read King Solomon's Mines. Like The Coral Island, very hard to read. Again, I see this book in Waterstones advertised for children, and yet it's so problematic. It's basically the same themes as we see in The Coral Island. I also read Mapping the Holy Land by Haim Gorin, which is off the back of King Solomon's Mines because there is a map in that book, and it got me thinking, oh, I really want to read more about maps. Maps and cartography is so interesting. So I read this book, and it's basically about spaces which appear in the Bible. It's quite interesting. I mean, it wasn't, I don't know, it wasn't like particularly engaging. I've read much more engaging pieces of academic writing. I wouldn't recommend it. If you're really interested in mapping Christian spaces, then there are other sources that you can look at. I don't think you have to read a whole book on it. Next, A Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, one of my favourite books of all time, not just of this year. Oscar Wilde is of course a decadent writer. I think Oscar Wilde is probably the best writer of all time. I'm just gonna say it. Oscar Wilde is the best writer of all time. He's so incredibly witty, so clever, so observant, and really just cuts into the fabric of human experience. He's just incredible. Like, if you haven't read Oscar Wilde, just read as much as you can. Read his essays, read his plays, read The Picture of Dorian Gray. It's the idea that when we do bad things, it imprints itself on our physical bodies. So if I stole something, you'd be able to see that on my face. It changes your countenance, changes the person you are. But instead of changing his actual face, it changes like this portrait which is hidden away. It's such a clever concept. Next, I read Selling the Holocaust by Tim Cole, and this is a criticism of Holocaust remembrance again, and this idea that like the Holocaust has kind of been Disneyfied and films will capitalize on it, and Tim Cole says it's a bit like an amusement park. It's really worth reading if you're interested in Holocaust remembrance and the best way for us to remember the Holocaust, because he does really cast criticism on like what we shouldn't be doing, but he doesn't really offer an alternative solution. Next, I read On Murder Considered as One of the Fine Arts by Thomas de Quincey, which is a collection of 2 essays, and it was so brilliantly hilarious. It's basically a defense of like why murder is a really good thing, obviously satirical, and I think he was part of a society for like the appreciation of murder, and so it's written like a manifesto. It's just so funny, just seeing like the pure art form of it and how it can be a really beautiful thing and how it can be well crafted. I read The Five by Hallie Rubenhold. These are the stories of the 5 women who were murdered by Jack the Ripper. We hear so much about Jack the Ripper, but we don't hear about the women that he murdered. It takes the lives of these 5 women and like retells them. Really incredible research from Rubenhold. The use of primary sources to unpick stories which aren't often told, like the stories of working class people. There aren't documents for them in the same way that you have with like a Viscount. I think it was a really cool historical academic venture, and also unpicking that myth that they were all prostitutes, which was used at the time to kind of like almost weirdly perversely justify the fact that they were murdered. I read a few short stories by New Women Movement. So I read The Reckoning by Edith Wharton, also The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Both of those were great. Yellow Wallpaper especially, one of my favourite short stories. It's about a woman who is going mad. The Knife of Never Letting Go. Oh my gosh, I'm going out for a walk now with my parents, and I'm not even halfway through these books. I'll do a few more and then I'll go and I'll have to change angles. But I read The Knife of Never Letting Go by Patrick Ness, which I love Patrick Ness's work. I hadn't read any of his like intense fantasy though before, and I've got to say I think I prefer his realistic fiction, like A Monster Calls, The Ocean Was Our Sky, to The Knife of Never Letting Go. It's a society of men, like only men living together in this community, and everyone can hear each other's thoughts. such a cool concept. On the Sacred by Gordon Lynch is examining what it means for something to be sacred. I'm pretty sure it's like the most seminal book on the definition of the sacred. Dead Famous by Greg Jenner is a history of celebrity. It's not a chronological account, which is what I was expecting. It's broken into like features of celebrity, and it goes through all of these, like trying to understand what it actually means to be a celebrity using past examples, contemporary examples, and linking that all together and like thinking about our culture as a celebrity culture. Greg Jenner's a great historical writer. The Truants by Kate Weinberg was one of the worst books I read this year. Absolutely hated it. It looked like it was going to be a wonderful dark academia book. It really sounded a bit like Secret History from the blurb, which is, I'll tell you what it says it's about. In the seductive coming-of-age debut, Jess Walker, a young and uninitiated first-year student, falls in love with two great storytellers. It's like at university, it sounded like it was going to be incredible, but actually it was just really dull, and the characters weren't like that great. They were just kind of like a bit meh, not really that interesting. It was very anticlimactic at the end as well, bad ending. Just don't waste your time on this book. It looks like it's so good, but it's not. The Hen Who Dreamed She Could Fly, it by Sum Mi Huang, is a very short book, very quick, but beautiful philosophy. It's a bit like that poem about the pig by Roald Dahl. This hen realizes she is going to be killed for her meat when she can no longer lay eggs. It casts criticism on that model, which is so important from a vegetarianism, veganism point of view, but also we see her redefining what it means to be a hen. It encourages us to redefine the kind of box that we set ourselves in and let ourselves go beyond like the label that we've been given. And then finally, for now, and I'll come back, is Lanny by Max Porter, which again is one of the best books I've read this year and maybe one of my favourite books of all time now. It's about a gifted, highly sensitive child who is nothing like the other children around him. This otherworldly sprite, like so attentive to the beauty of nature. Just the way he sees the world is incredible, and it's amazing to be able to see the world through his eyes for a little while, even though we don't actually. It's narrated by the adults who are looking in at Lanny. The narrative voice is also so interesting. I won't go into it, but just really fantastic use of narrative. And I'm actually now going to go on this walk, and I'll do the other half of this video later. 45 minutes to film just that much, so this is going to be a long old video, but I hope you're enjoying it. Hopefully you've got a cup of tea like me. I finished mine, so I'm gonna have to get another one. I'm back now from my walk, and let's get back to reviewing these books. Where did I get up to? Next, Half a Creature from the Sea by David Almond. This is a collection of short stories. David Almond obviously wrote Skellig. He writes in a wonderfully like realistic way. He's a children's writer, but his writing is very realist. There were very few books in my local library that week that I had any inclination to read, and I wanted to get one YA book out, but there was like hardly any that week in, and so I chose this one. There were a few short stories in there that I liked. The thing I really love about David Almond is that he does create very believable characters. He's very good at characterization, and he also draws on the universal experience of being a child, so I find that when I read him, I'm instantly taken back to like how it felt to be a child. Like, he captures childhood very well, just in the little observations that kids make, the things that they focus on. A Defense of Cosmetics by Max Beerbohm, 1894, and it was published in the first edition of the Yellow Book, which was this magazine which was really famous with the athletes. Got the Yellow Book mentioned in the picture of Dorian Gray, for example. This essay is satirical and kind of making fun of the decadent movement. I don't really remember that much about it though, to be honest, so it can't have been that striking or revolutionary. Then I reread The Professor's House by Willa Cather. I love this book, honestly, like wow. So it's this professor of Spanish history, and it's a reflective book, so he's thinking back on his past and like the student that he had. So he has a student called Tom who is just totally unlike any of the other students that he's ever had. I love Tom as a character. He's so intensely fascinated with the world and learning for the sake of learning. So he found the remains of this civilization, and he'd taken them to the Smithsonian to try and get funding for the excavation. But my favourite scene in the book, he speaks to these museum curators, and they're just so detached from the actual real like wonder of the experience of like finding these things, and it all just becomes a technicality. I love the relationship that the professor and Tom have. Cather plays with identity very well. The professor basically like identifies and like finds his whole identity in Tom. You know, it's called The Professor's House. He becomes the professor that Tom knows. Then I read some short stories. I love Sherlock Holmes. I think they're great, really clever. And I read The Greatest Shows on Earth, which is by Linda Simon. This is a history of the circus, and it speaks a lot about P.T. Barnum, as you can imagine, like giving you the real insight into that and how he was basically obsessed with the celebrity. I read Am I Normal Yet by Holly Bourne, which I know was really, really big in like 2012. 2013. I feel like everyone read it then, but I just completely missed it. It's about a girl who has OCD. She had been in hospital, but she's now left and she's like going to college and she just wants to be normal, but she doesn't know what that looks like. How to Be a Victorian by Ruth Goodman. Ruth Goodman is a Victorian scholar and also someone who in her research will like practically implement these things into her life. So if she reads about like a Victorian practice of washing up, she'll actually go ahead and do that, which I think is such a cool method for like thinking about history. And this book is a guide to Victorian daily life, so it goes from the beginning of the day to the end of the day and tells you about like how Victorians, what they'd have for breakfast and how they'd travel places, and it's just so good. Honestly, if you like the Victorians, you'll love this. Cuckoo Song by Frances Hardinge. I love her like kind of quasi-magical realism writing. This isn't as good as The Lie Tree, but still good. Oh no, I can't spoil it. I can't even say what it's about. Just Tris feels like things aren't quite right and she doesn't know why and she can't remember certain things. So I read The Tattooist of Auschwitz by Heather Morris and I didn't actually like this. I think, okay, on the one hand I think it's good because it's important for the Holocaust to be spoken about in public life and for it to be something accessible. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but for it to be accessible for people to actually learn about. Mass media and like popular books like The Tattooist of Auschwitz can be really useful for furthering Holocaust remembrance, but also I found it was very surface level and it felt very plot driven as a book, which isn't necessarily a problem, but it felt very out of sorts with the fact that this is a book about the Holocaust. I think you can't just listen to events, but you want to reflect on them, you need to reflect on them, and this book very much lacked that. Also very sensationalist. Again, it's got both pluses and minuses because sensationalist literature, like with the Victorian period, you know, with Mary Barton and Cry of the Children that I spoke about earlier, like they can shock us into thinking about these issues, make us realise, gosh, this is a massive problem, this was really awful. But also it runs the risk of detaching us from it because it becomes this really distant thing where we're like, oh well, that's just so awful that how can I ever get my head around it? And the other thing which I would problematize about this book, Lael is Jewish and yet the book basically writes out his Jewishness. There's basically not a single reference to the fact that he is Jewish. I really think this needs to have been mentioned in the book. The author was writing Lael's story on behalf of him, like it's a true story and it was being rewritten by somebody. And in his later life, Lael was a very active participant in Jewish matters. I think his Jewish faith should have been spoken about more in the book because it was basically never mentioned. Next, I read The Didache by Rumer Godden, which was recommended to me by Blakeney. All of these books actually. So Blakeney and I had a Sunday where we went to the library and we took out our favourite children's books that the other one hadn't ever read, and then we sat down and spent the whole day reading them, and these are the ones that I read. So I'll speak about these very briefly, but The Didache, a little bit like a little princess. She's such a great character. I wish that I read this when I was younger because I would have loved it. I read How to Cheat a Dragon's Curse by Cressida Cowell. I never read How to Train Your Dragon when I was little, so I read that. I also read Awful End by Philip Ardagh, which is really quite funny. It reminded me a bit of Jeremy Strong. Fox Friend by Michael Morpurgo. I never liked Michael Morpurgo's books when I was younger. Controversial opinion, I just didn't like them. I read Hubert Horatio by Lauren Child. This was like a World Book Day book, so very short. Hubert Horatio is hilarious, honestly so funny, and Lauren Child is great. Her illustrations are so nostalgic of the Charlie and Lola books. Next, Heidi by Joanna Spyri. I can't believe I didn't read this when I was younger. Beautiful book. Heidi represents this wonderful appreciation for nature, a bit like with The Secret Garden, and sees the world and just through these incredible like grateful eyes, and really just draws attention to why nature, the natural world, needs to be protected. Next, The Family Tree by Mel Peet. The Family Tree is about a man who comes back to his family home and is thinking about when his mum and dad had separated. Just think it was done very well again, like taking on the child voice in a very convincing way, and had really wonderful illustrations as well. Beautifully illustrated book is Sea Prep. It's like a picture book about a man and a boy who are forced to flee their country when war hits, and they become refugees. It's great having this refugee narrative from like the other side of really humanizing people who are refugees. Like we always say, you know, refugees, but obviously these are people who are refugees. It's not like that's the core of their identity, and this book really brings attention to that. And the illustrations really add to the narrative as well. It's a lyrical letter to his child, a man who's been forced to seek asylum, and he's writing this letter to his child so his child doesn't forget like the rich beauty of the country that they fled. And it's shown in the illustrations. You've got these wonderful marketplaces, and then the next page, it's shocking. You turn the page and it's just black. It's just a war zone. And I read some short stories by F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Cup Bowl and The Diamond as Big as the Ritz. Loved these. Fitzgerald is one of my favourite short story writers. I've spoken about these a lot actually in a readathon I did this year. I also read The Death of Francis Bacon by Max Porter, same author as Lanny, and was expecting big things from this because I loved Lanny so much, but I found this very confusing, to be honest, because mainly because I approached Francis Bacon as like the Victorian guy as opposed to the artist who like died in the 90s, and so I was very confused, and I read half of the book and then I went back and read the other half. It's only short. So Francis Bacon was an artist who died by himself in a country where he didn't speak the language, and Max Porter recreates like his last 6 days and writes it as like kind of what his thoughts might have been. Really clever narrative as well. Max Porter plays the narrative in really interesting ways, and I really want to read more of his work. I read Mayday by S. Scott Fitzgerald again, and then I read Against Nature by Huysman. This is another decadent book. I love the decadent movement. It's basically this one character. There's not even like a plot. It's basically he's going through all of these things like he's interested in and learning about them, becomes obsessed with scent, and then he becomes obsessed with like paintings, interior of like a monastery. It's just all of these sensory based things he becomes obsessed with. But next I Was a Rat by Philip Pullman, again a recommendation from Blakeney, about a rat who becomes a boy. Next, Hamlet by William Shakespeare, which I somehow had never read. I really loved Hamlet. It was so good, and I now really want to see it in performance, because reading the script it's obviously different to watching it in performance, and I really want to watch the Gregory Doran one because apparently it uses surveillance and cameras. Just to give you a summary, a young man called Hamlet who is visited by the ghost of his late father, and his father wants him to avenge his killer. And within the play you have a play that Hamlet puts on of the story of like basically what's happened where the king has been killed, and Doran really pays attention to that. Actors. And so the cameras add one extra level to that. Yes, I was really interested in the themes of like sight especially, and also madness of course is fascinating in this period. Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption by Stephen King. Very different to anything else by Stephen King. It's not like a horror story in the same way. I was not expecting to love this as much as I did. Wow, it was just, so it's set in a prison and narrated by a character who really isn't like that unique, to be honest. He's just like a normal guy, and I think that's also the beauty of it, because we've got such a tendency to dehumanize criminals and people who are prisoners, but they are still real people, and the like banality of a lot of this book really is testament to that. But oh my gosh, what's his name? I can't remember his name now, but one of the characters in this, Red, oh my gosh, Red is just one of the best characters ever. He's so kind and gentle, and just, I want to be his friend. We're All Made of Molecules by Susan Nielsen. Received a lot of hype, so I read it. Wasn't particularly keen, honestly. I had to kind of force my way through this book. It was a bit boring. Letter Writing and Social Practice by David Barton. I love books about letter writing etiquette. I find letter writing etiquette very fascinating. They're not featured on this, obviously, but I read a lot of like letters from people in my free time. So this book is about the social significance of letter writing. Next, The Body by Bill Bryson. This book is wonderful. Like every chapter is on a different part of the body. So you've got like one on skin, one on like the digestive system, one on the brain, one on hair. It just tells you loads and loads of science and cool facts about this, and there are some really unique weird facts in there too, which is fun. So I really liked it. It's really big, but it's very accessible. Then I read Sleep No More by P.D. James. This is a collection of like short horror stories. They were so good. Oh my gosh. Find Me by Andre Aciman. This is the sequel to Call Me By Your Name, and I really didn't expect to like this. I read it because I had heard so many people saying it was rubbish, and I wanted to like form my own opinion of that. I loved Call Me By Your Name, read Find Me, and really loved Find Me. Like, it's not as good as Call Me By Your Name, but sequels basically never are. Got the same like writing style as Call Me By Your Name, of course. It's still very like slow-paced, reflective, lyrical, and like observation-based again. Aciman's writing style, it's like tactile. It's narrated by Elio's father. So you start with Elio's father, then Elio, and then Oliver. It's really cool being able to see like the narratives infusing, and I think Aciman's really good at like stressing the importance of individual small moments and how those mean so much, and they are so significant. We Were Lies by E. Lockhart. I reread this. I read this for the first time in 2014 on like a coach ride for a school trip, and it was just as good the second time. This has been like massive on like BookTube and BookTok this year, I know, but if you've somehow managed to escape it and haven't read it, you need to. It's about the Sinclair family who every summer go to stay on this island that their family own. There's a fire. Candace can't work out what has happened. Like, her memory of the event is blank. It's really, really clever, really fast-paced, beautifully written, and also raises some really important class issues and what things are really important, asking that question. I read The Woman Reader by Kate Flint, which is about how women's literature became, like, grew in the Victorian to Edwardian period, and like the market of writing for women. Dry by Neil Shusterman, a dystopian society, but not actually dystopian, because this could totally happen, where the water runs dry in California and suddenly there's no water, and it's basically asking what would happen in society, how would people respond. It's only California which has had their water supply cut off, and it's like thinking about how the rest of the world is reacting and how quickly the world descends into chaos without water as one of the most stable, like, important things. And it's a great call for us to be more mindful about water consumption. Pairing with this, you should read When the Rivers Run Dry by Fred Pierce, which I think is a great companion to this, showing like that we are actually approaching a situation where we might run out of water. The Willoughbys by Lois Lowry is contemporary children's book, but it's written in the tradition of all other children's books. So it takes key tropes from children's literature and then fuses them all together into this wonderfully funny, satirical book where you can recognise all of these tropes. What Happened by Hillary Clinton. I've been reading this for, I kid you not, like a year. Started it around the elections in November 2020 and then only finished it in summer 2021. Not because I didn't enjoy it, but I read half and then put it down and then came back to it. But I really liked them. I'd read some of Hillary Clinton's memoirs before and give a very good insight into the election process. The Gentleman's Model Letter Writer, a complete guide to correspondence, which is another Victorian letter writing etiquette guide. I read Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy, which I'd somehow neglected to read. I haven't actually read that much Thomas Hardy. I really love Bathsheba as a character. She might be one of my favourite characters in classical English literature. Fiery and strong, even though it really frustrates me how halfway through she just completely changes when she falls in love with Troy. I'm actually going to be quicker now because this is the, third time that I've sat down to do more of this. I've just got myself some more tea. I hope you've got some tea too. I'm going to do a taste test. So, I like this glass teacup. I got this for my 16th birthday, I think, but I just didn't really use it. Doesn't really taste like much. This is a banana tea from Bird and Blend. It has got a banana-y aftertaste, but it's very, very subtle. I wonder if some milk will bring it out. It's a black tea, so I do usually add. I like my tea very milky. It just doesn't really taste like much. It's quite flavourless, but it smells nice. Maybe it'll be better when it's brewed for a bit longer. This is the teapot. Next, we have got Collaborative Dickens, authorship, and Victorian Christmas periodicals. This is when I went through a phase during the summer of being really, really interested in Christmas literature and the beginnings of Christmas literature in Victorian England. Dickens published Christmas stories in his periodicals. Christmas stories were really, he was really famous for those. They came out in like November and December and January. It's called Collaborative Dickens because he would help edit them, and they wouldn't have names attached to them, so they'd all be anonymous. They were kind of accredited to Dickens in a way. Also, I'm tasting the banana now more. How to Be Brave by Daisy May Johnson. I was sent this from Pushkin Press very kindly. It was so good. I loved it. I'd really recommend this. I'm trying to think, what's it like? It's a bit like Alice Miranda, I guess, but it's about a boarding school, of course. Very typical middle grade fiction. Girl is sent away to boarding school and the headmistress is absolutely awful. She's so horrible. The school used to be this incredible place, but the headmistress has turned that around. Also, a school where everyone's obsessed with baking, so there are these incredibly lush descriptions of cakes and biscuits, and everyone's always eating jammy dodgers and rich teas and chocolate digestives. It is a charming children's book, and I really like the three main characters. A Bit of a Stretch by Chris Atkins. So Chris Atkins was a filmmaker who was sent to prison for 18 months, and he wrote up his diaries from while he was there, giving this harrowing insight into the prison system and what needs to change. It's like a manifesto in that sense. Again, as I say, like with the Stephen King book, we tend to not think about prisoners, and that's a massive shortcoming on our part. You know, they say that you can understand the most about somebody based on like how they treat those who are kind of seen as less than them. The way that we treat our prisoners really reflects on what kind of society we are, and there are massive problems in the prison system that this book shows. The False Rose by Jacob Waglius. It's got a talking monkey in it. And it's about, like, they're looking for this magical rose thing. Well, it's not magical, but there's this precious rose and they're on a ship hunting for it. It had some kind of dark academia notes to it. I didn't enjoy it though. I didn't think it was all that engaging, though the illustrations are beautiful. Picnic at Hanging Rock by Joan Lindsay. A school goes for a picnic and 3 girls and 1 teacher go missing, and it's kind of the repercussions of that one event and how it has such major effects on everybody. I really like the aesthetic of this book as well. I like the actual story, but I think the aesthetic of it is what carries it. Victorian Christmas in Print by Tara Moore, another book that I read because I was interested in Christmas literature. Then I read Sketches by Boz by Charles Dickens. This is in my top 3 Dickens books. So it's A Christmas Carol, Sketches by Boz, and A Tale of Two Cities. And Sketches by Boz is like Dickens' earliest published work. So he was originally a journalist and known as the Inimitable Boz, that was his pseudonym. Sketches by Boz is a collection of all of lots of articles that he published in magazines, so it's separated into sections like places, people, couples, places, situations, and it gives this incredible insight into London at the time. And it's also a really great thing to preface any reading of Dickens, because you're introduced to Dickens's London and you know and kind of like walk the streets with him. You kind of grow to know it, and so it's really cool as well in his later books where you see him recycling these images which he shows in sketches. And just as the name suggests, they are sketches. They're these tiny like subsections of life, and it's almost like time has paused in that moment, the closest we'll ever get to living in Victorian London. A Skinful of Shadows by Frances Hardinge again. I think I expected good things from this because I'd read Carcassonne earlier this year and had liked that. I gave it 2 stars. It's about like kind of this girl's got this like second spirit inside of her voice, and this spirit who's trying to control her. The Water Babies by Charles Kingsley. Again, very famous Victorian book, one of the earliest. I think it was like a contemporary to Alice in Wonderland as one of the first Victorian books. It's about a chimney sweep boy who turns into a water baby, like this water sprite. You could treat it as a criticism of Victorian London and the way that children were being treated, and like this is kind of the alternative to like what childhood should look like. A Tunnel Through Time by Gillian Tundall is about the history of the London Underground. Interesting, a few like cool facts in there. It's quite niche, but it was good. Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller, one of the best books I read this year. Oh my goodness, everyone speaks about it so much, but there is a reason for that. I'm currently editing this video and this is incredibly embarrassing, but I got Patroclus's name wrong for the whole of this clip when I was reviewing it. I called him Polonius, who is a character in Hamlet. I don't know where my brain was, but please excuse the fact that I misnamed him for the whole of this review. My brain was obviously fried by this point because I had been filming for hours. This book is exceptional, one of the best books I read this year. So I started this book and it took me ages to get into it. Like, I read the first chapter, didn't really like it that much. I was like, oh, it's really overhyped, that's a shame. I thought I'd really like it. So I put it to one side and like kind of kept on coming back to it to read like a page or two, but I was dragging myself through. And then suddenly, about 30 pages in, I just got hooked and I read it very, very quickly off. So it's a retelling, of course, of the myth of Achilles, but it's from Polonius's point of view instead of Achilles. This love, this beautiful, like tender, tactile, pure love which develops between Polonius and Achilles. Polonius is not very respected in society, and then Achilles is one of the most respected people in the land. You know, he's half god, and they fall in love, and I just love how that takes the centre stage. Like, Achilles he's respected as a military man, but the very core of his identity is his love. I think it's just a great like example of the things that are actually important about our identity. So we might be remembered for doing something really incredible. So the person who like discovers the postage stamp is remembered for discovering the postage stamp. That's not actually the really important thing that maybe they did, and the most important thing would have been the relationships in their lives. I really want to read more by her. Jonathan Livingston Seagull by Richard Bach is a story about a seagull accompanied by lots of photographs of seagulls. Book about philosophy. It's kind of, you know, like testing the edges, going to the edges of what humans or seagulls are capable of. Jonathan is interested in flight. Like, he's a seagull and he's not just flying because he needs to get somewhere. He's flying because he loves to fly and he wants to kind of push the boundaries of what he can do. It's like quite platonic, you know, asking us to go to the limits of what's possible and do things because we enjoy doing them. Ungovernable by Teresa O'Neill is about parenting practices in Victorian England. Quite funny. Famous Five I never read. I started reading it when I was a kid, didn't like it. If I'd read it when I was younger, I would have, and like actually properly given it a go, maybe I would have liked it. I found it, again, like it's one of those books where it was uncomfortable to read and I was very aware of this kind of quasi-colonialist narrative that Blyton adopts, which when I read something like Malory Towers I don't see, probably because those are books that I grew up with, but reading this as somebody who'd never read The Famous Five, that was so abundantly clear. Next I read The Little Book of Chanel by Emma Baxter Wright, story of the life of Chanel and the life of the brand as well. I really admire how Coco Chanel as a person was so resistant to like fashion trends of the Edwardian period. You know, she didn't want women to be restricted. For Chanel, the emphasis is on like practicality. You wear your clothes and then you do things whilst you're wearing them. So something like, you know, the iconic shoes where you've got the black top at the front. That's so you can like scuff your shoes, you can walk around in them. White shoes don't make any sense. Next to The Letter by Simon Garfield, really enjoyed this. It's a love letter to letters. Where it develops, it goes through Cicero's letters. You've got like Sylvia Plath, Ted Hughes, Emily Dickinson, and that's interweaved with like historical details like postal reform. When I Had Little Sister by Catherine Simpson, the autobiography of a woman whose sister struggled with her mental health and depression and eventually committed suicide. The House Without Windows is a book which was written by a 12-year-old girl, which is crazy. This is a really old book as well. I think it's like 1900s. It's about this girl who decides that she wants to live in nature, so she literally just leaves her house and she goes and lives in the fields, and then she travels to ocean, she travels to meadows. Like, it's just, oh my goodness, it's beautiful, her appreciation for nature, and it just makes you want to be outside. Emily of New Moon, very similar. Montgomery actually says she prefers Emily to Anne, which is quite funny because obviously Anne is the really popular one. I prefer Anne. Emily is still a great character though, and I love that she loves writing so much. The Mother's Blessing is the first book that I read for my early modern module. It's this book Dorothy Lay left to her children, her 3 sons, when she died on her deathbed, because the mother had this really important integral role for educating her children, and Dorothy Lay died before she was able to properly educate her children. So she goes through and lists like, this is how you should do this is how you should find a wife, this is how you should pray, and it gives a really great insight into like family dynamics. A Chaste Maiden Cheapside by Thomas Middleton, a play which is really desperately funny. I read Emily Dickinson's Letters by Emily Dickinson. It's like a collected work. I love her letters so much. Emily Dickinson's my favourite poet, and I was going to write my dissertation on her letters. I decided not to, but I still really wish I was. Honestly, I'm getting second thoughts now because I really want to write on them. I love that she wrote her letters as gifts to people, and the fusion between her poetry and her letters becomes so abundantly clear when you read these because you can't quite tell when the poems begin. Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. I'd already read this, but I really enjoyed rereading it. I mean, it's one of his shortest books, but it's still quite long, but it doesn't feel very long at all. Also, I think one of the cool things about reading this book is you don't realise how different it is to the film. The film is the one that we tend to have in like the public consciousness, etc. And so especially something like Fagin, I think he's presented quite favourably in the film, but in the book the portrayal is very anti-Semitic, and I hadn't actually realised how much so till I read it. Some writers, historians say that this is like the depiction of Fagin like literally helped to bring about a revival in anti-Semitism, which is crazy. Atonement by Ian McEwan I reread this year. Again, one of my favourites. I love Ian McEwan. I think he's probably my favourite modern writer. I do want to read more of his work. A girl called, what's her name again? Bryony. She's 13 and she witnesses her sister flirting with this boy. It's kind of like the implications of that and what happens as a result of that one single moment. Again, I think Ian McEwan is great at like taking tiny moments. Like, he describes individual moments so well, like the significance that a single moment can have. You know, you're very like living in the present with McEwan's books. I also love how it deals with time. This is one of the things that the book is most famous for. I feel like it very much mirrors how children see time. Bryony is a character I don't know what to make of. You're so frustrated by her because she does understand what she's doing, but then also, does she? It's like this question of accountability. At what age can a child be held accountable? At what point are we accountable for our actions? Because, I mean, Bryony knows what she's doing, but she doesn't understand the repercussions of what she's doing, and she doesn't understand the extent of what she's doing because she is still so young. Also, one line I loved in this book, right at the beginning, but hidden drawers, lockable diaries, and cryptographic systems could not conceal from Bryony the simple truth She had no secrets. Her wish for a harmonious, organised world denied her the reckless possibilities of wrongdoing. Hymenai by Ben Jonson. This is a masque actually, so not a play. Masques were very popular in the court of James I, and they were these incredible spectacles. The closest parallel that we have today is something like the Olympic opening ceremony, so they'd involve a monarch in the same way, and they'd be like elaborate, really over the top, very, very expensive, and only performed once. So Hymenai is actually just like an account of what happened at the masque, as opposed to it being a script directing people to go and like recreate it. Then I reread A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. As always, I love this book. It always gets me into the festive spirit, and I read this in October, so I felt very, very Christmassy from there on out. It just really makes you attentive to like what you don't want to be and what you do want to be, and what the important things are, and how we should live with the spirit of Christmas within us all year long. Like my dad and I love that final line, Scrooge knew how to keep Christmas well. Then I read Milton's Comus, which is again a masque, but this was performed by Lord Edgerton's children, so it's a domestic play. Like the script was written for these three children to perform it for their parents. Milton's so aware the whole way through of the fact that the parents are going to be watching it. I've studied this again on my module, and it's my favourite text that we looked at. It's so different from anything else I've read, but it's still got Milton's wonderful poetic style. Next I read the Oxford Handbook of the Early Modern Sermon. I really find sermons interesting. It's one of my favourite types of literature actually. I read a lot of sermons for fun, especially early modern ones. The majority of literature which was published in the early modern period was sermons. It's like the most popular thing by far, and yet we spend so much time looking at plays and poetry, but like sermons are kind of neglected, even though there was so much. And I just wanted to learn more about what the form of the sermon was, etc., so that I could approach like my reading of sermons in my free time with like a better knowledge. I reread Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, Romeo and Juliet by William Shakespeare. I actually enjoyed it more this time than I had in the past. I have seen Romeo and Juliet a few times, and I've read it once at school. Didn't really enjoy it that much. It's always been one of my least favourite Shakespeare plays, and I've kind of thought it was a little bit overhyped. But rereading it and paying attention to the script properly, there are some beautiful, beautiful moments in Romeo and Juliet. Next, David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, which I'd never read before, but I really liked it. I especially like the first half of it, when he's at school, when he's a child. I think Dickens does childhood very well in this book. I also really love Dora as a character. She's just such an interesting character. You get really frustrated with her, like I really got frustrated with Dora, but she's also just like so, like, because you want to unpick her, you want to understand her. David tries to like educate her and make her less silly, etc., but she just doesn't want to change, and she wants to remain ignorant. Shoemaker's Holiday by Thomas Dekker, another play. The Opposite of Butterfly Hunting by Ivana Lynch. So Ivana Lynch played Luna Lovegood in the Harry Potter films, and these are her memoirs. Truly beautiful writing. I pre-ordered this book, and I wanted to read it because I really like Ivana Lynch as a person, you know. I think she's really cool, but I've got to say that I was reading it for the sake of the fact, like, because it was Ivana Lynch. But I love this book in its own right, and I would have liked it even if Ivana Lynch hadn't been the one to write it. Her voice is so genuine and raw and authentic, and it's just not what you'd expect from a celebrity book. It documents her struggles with an eating disorder, her recovery from that, and then her like time working in Harry Potter and how that like impacts her and affects her. And it's a story of growth. Just to note, that is a book about eating disorder recovery. She does say that she's very careful not to make it triggering. She doesn't include any numbers in this book or any like specific examples of foods that she's eating. De Profundis by Oscar Wilde was a letter that Oscar Wilde wrote while he was in prison. I love letters. I love Oscar Wilde. Of course I was going to enjoy this. It's filled with all the same wit and like beautiful language that his books and plays and essays are. It reads more like a manifesto though, because it's so long. In this letter he kind of like speaks about like the crimes for which he has been sent to prison for, which of course is him being gay. Interestingly, like, he's not defensive of his actions. He calls them sinful and is openly disdainful of himself, and we see him having to lie and act so that he can be respected when he leaves prison. That's kind of seems to be his aim. Then I read The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. Again, this was a reread because I was going to see the play, which was performed by the National Theatre. I went by myself and it was phenomenal. Oh my gosh, the play. I don't know if it's still on. If it is, you should try and go if you're around London. I was just blown away by the performance. The Ocean at the End of the Lane is a wonderful, wonderful book. I think it's my favourite Neil Gaiman. And a man returns to his family home for a funeral, and he's taken back, he's transported back to his childhood where he met a young girl called Letty who had an ocean at the end of her lane. Like, she had this ocean, this pond, which she called an ocean. The book is magical realism at its finest. Neil Gaiman's style is so lyrical. Again, using that word lyrical, this means like, you know this means that I liked it. He uses overlapping clauses and really pays attention to the sound and rhythm of the words. His writing genuinely does feel like music. When you read any of it aloud, you just think like, wow, oh my gosh, this is music. This is what I said about the book when I read it. I said he chooses words which are delicate and sensory, light enough that you can just about touch them, and weaves them together to create the impression of an idea. This helps to build the child voice because when you're young, you only have impressions of the world and haven't necessarily formed opinions or an awareness about it yet. There are so many weird like fantasy elements to this book, which is really cool. But I think like the really great thing about this book is trying to say that we're not what we look like. Like how we look is the least important thing about us, which we all know, but this book just makes that so abundantly clear. And I think as well, when I say appearances as well, like names are just another kind of appearance for Gaiman in this book. I just think everyone has to read this. Then I read Bleak House by David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Probably my least favourite of the books that we read on my Charles Dickens module. I like the descriptions of London though. The descriptions of the London fog are my favourites out of any of the Dickens books that I'd read. So like kind of in terms of like the scenery descriptions, they were my favourites. The narrative is cool because it switches between Esther and then this like third person narrator. I think it's really cool that we have a female character narrating because that's very, very unusual in Dickens. A Woman Killed with Kindness by Thomas Hayward is one of my favourite plays we read on my early modern module. This play is renowned for being one of the first like domestic plays. So Shakespeare focuses a lot on royal families and upper class families, but A Woman Killed with Kindness is about a normal family in early modern England. 'Tis Pity She's a Whore by John Ford is next. This is a book about incest between a brother and sister. Next I read The Diaries of Lady Anne Clifford. So yeah, there's this wonderful bit at the beginning where she's 13 and she witnesses Queen Elizabeth's funeral. And the really cool thing as well, like these diaries give us such a good insight into what it meant to be a girl in early modern England, because she wasn't allowed to participate in the funeral even though she was related because she was too young. I really liked these and I want to read more diaries from the early modern period. I've read My Old Maze as well and I liked those, but I didn't put these on here because I only read half of her diaries because I couldn't find the rest of it. I couldn't find in the library, which is really sad. Next, Hard Times by Charles Dickens. So you've got kind of two separate social issues which Dickens is dealing with in this book. You've got education and the problems and shortcomings of that, and then you've also got like factory reform, factory workers, quite similar to Mary Barton in that regard. The thing I really like is the stuff on education. So you've got the schoolmaster called Gradgrind, and one of my favourite scenes is like right at the beginning, but still I think it's the best bit of the whole book. He's teaching his students what a horse is, and he asks his students, what is a horse? Louisa's father is a veterinary surgeon. He's worked with horses. Louisa's known horses, but she can't give a definition. He says like a horse is a quadruped, and it's basically showing us the difference between different types of knowledge. What is knowledge? What does it mean to know something? Louisa knows horses, but she doesn't know like the science behind them, and I think both of these types of knowledge are important, but we see them both in the extremes. Okay, so Bitzer, said Thomas Gradgrind, your definition of a horse: quadruped, graminivorous, 40 teeth, namely 24 grinders, 4 eye teeth and 12 incisive. Shed coats in the spring, in marshy countries, sheds hoofs do. Hoofs hard, but requiring to be shod with an iron. Age known by marks in mouth. Now, girl number 20, said Mr. Gradgrind, you know what a horse is. Then we're coming to the last few. As you can see, I did not do very much reading in the final term of university. And I read A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. It's one of my favourite books ever. I wish I'd read it sooner. I can't believe I only just read it, but I'm also really glad because to have read that for the first time this year has been wonderful. Story of the French Revolution, Dickens' most popular book as well, sold the most copies. French Revolution, of course, occurred in 1789, was very much part of the public consciousness in the mid-19th century. Thomas Carlyle published his French Revolution history. In A Tale of Two Cities, you see like the process of the French Revolution. It's used as a backdrop to the actual story. My favourite character is Carton, and the scene right at the end, which I'm not going to give away, but I love the Christian allusions in this. I think it basically, like, it is his most theological book, proposing that we should act in a Christian way, but also really criticising Christian institutions as corrupt. I don't even know what else to say about this book. I just really enjoyed it. Then I read A Literary Christmas, which is like a British library anthology. Dipped into this over the course of Christmas. It's just a collection and anthology of passages about Christmas from pieces of literature and I read it most years. I just really enjoy it. It always gets me into the festive mood. And then the final book I read is Empowered, Turning Lemons into Lemonade, which is V's memoir. Incredible to hear V's story. You know, it's called Empowered and it is empowering in the truest sense of the word to see what V has achieved. I'm sure you follow V on YouTube and Instagram, and if you don't, you definitely should, because she is just one of the most uplifting, positive people that you'll come across online. It's amazing to hear everything she had to come up against to get where she is now, and her story is truly inspiring, but it's also interlaced with so much advice, so much practical advice for people. Despite racism, education inequality and bullying, V continue to be positive. But yes, there are all the books that I read in 2021, not 2022. Just been sipping on this tea the whole time. It's really good, actually. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. I was going to also talk about my top 5 favourite books I read this year. Maybe I'll name them, but I probably won't go into any more depth because I have spoken about these books in quite a lot of detail and this video is probably very, very long. Okay, I'm going to say 14 favourite books because I read like 136 books, so I'm going to round that up to 140, which means this would be like 10% of the books I read. So in no particular order, my favourite books were The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett, The Diamond as Big as the Ritz by F. Scott Fitzgerald, Eichmann in Jerusalem by Hannah Arendt, On Earth We Are Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong, The Midnight Library by Matt Haig, How to Be a Victorian by Ruth Goodman, Lanny by Max Porter, Find Me by Andre Aciman, A Bit of a Stretch, How to Be Brave, Sketches by Boz by Charles Dickens, A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, To the Letter, and Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. I'm also going to say A Painter of Modern Life by Charles Baudelaire, but because that's an essay, I thought I could not include that in the top 14. And then just 3 books which get an honourable mention because they were rereads, not first-time reads, are Tenant of Wildfell Hall, The Picture of Dorian Gray, and We Were Liars. So if you're going to walk away reading any of those books, those are the ones that I would say you should prioritise. But thank you so much for watching this video. I'm sorry it was so long. Hopefully you managed to get through a lot of tea. I'd recommend this. Banana tea is very good. Why is it not more mainstream? Thank you so much for watching, and let me know if you want to see more book related videos, because I do love filming videos like this. Let me know if there are any particular ones that you'd like to see, and I hope that you have a productive week.